Today we're going to talk about some grammar points and how to use them. Today's grammar point is the modal verbs. As you know, we have a few modal verbs in English. Let's start with must, have to, and need to. Can you guess when we use must, have to, and need to? Of course, some of you know that must, have to, and need to, we use them for obligation or necessity in the present. What about had to and needed? If we want to talk about obligation or necessity in the past, I should use what? Had to and needed to. Here we have some examples about this point. I need to do my homework today. I need to do my homework. Here, there is a necessity in the present. If I said to you, I needed to get up early yesterday, here, this was a necessity in the past. That's why we use what? Needed to. Okay, here we have different modal verbs. Don't have to, don't need to, and needn't. We use these modal verbs to talk about what? Something which is not obligatory or necessary in the present. If there is no obligation or necessity in the present, we use one from these modal verbs. What about needn't have plus past participle of the verb? We use this expression to talk about what? Something happened, but it wasn't necessary. But in fact, it happened, but it wasn't necessary. What about didn't have to or didn't need to? We use didn't have to or didn't need to talk about something which didn't happen because it wasn't necessary. The first example, you needn't wake up early on Fridays. You needn't wake up early on Fridays. Here there is no necessity to wake up early because we are on Fridays. That's why we use needn't. What about this sentence? I took my driving license, but I needn't have taken it. This thing happened, but it wasn't necessary for me because maybe I don't have a car, for example. Okay? The next example. I didn't have to do that for the bank. I didn't have to do that for the bank. This thing didn't happen because it wasn't necessary. What about these modal verbs? Mustn't, can't, isn't, allowed to. We use these modal verbs to talk about what? Prohibition in the present. If we want to ban or forbid or prohibit something in the present, I should use one from these modal verbs. What about couldn't and wasn't allowed to? As you notice that these words in the past, that's why we use them to talk about what? Prohibition in the past. Example, you aren't allowed to smoke at school. Here, this is a kind of prohibition in the present. But if you want to talk about the past, I can say, you weren't allowed to sleep late, for example. What about should, ought to, and had better? We use should, ought to, had better for advice or recommendation in the present. What about if I want to talk about what? Advice or recommendation also in the past, or I want to criticize a past action and I want to show that it was a mistake. I should use one from these words. Should have plus past participle, shouldn't have plus past participle, ought to have plus past participle. Okay, so the modal verbs that are followed by have plus past participle are in the past. Okay, example, you should study hard. This is advice in the present. This is what? Advice in the present. You should have studied hard. If I want to say that someone was wrong when he didn't study hard, I want to show that for him, saying you should have studied hard. Look at these modal verbs. Ought, have, don't have, allowed, need, don't need. All these words should be followed by what? Try to guess. All these words should be followed by good, to plus infinitive. That's right, good. Here we have an example. You aren't allowed to sleep in the classroom. The word allowed here is one of these words and should be followed by to plus infinitive. That's why we have here to sleep. Should, must, mustn't, had better, needn't, can't. All these words should be followed by the infinitive of the verb, but without to. Good. Okay. Here we have an example about this. You can't smoke in hospitals. Here, can't is one of these modal verbs. That's why we use the infinitive of the verb, which is smoke, without any additions. Look at this one. Make a question. You have to be careful. You have to be careful. How can you make it into a question? The word have to, I should start with what? Do you have to? Do you have to be careful? Do you have to be careful? Change into negative. You should sleep early. You had better study hard. How can I negate the first sentence, which you should sleep early? Yeah, very good. I know that all of you know how to negate this sentence and change into negative by putting the word not after the modal verb should. Okay, so the answer will be you shouldn't sleep early. You had better study hard. How can I negate this sentence or change into negative? I can say you had better not study hard. You had better not study hard. Change into affirmative. You needn't take a driving license. Needn't take a driving license. As you know, the word needn't is a modal verb and should be followed by the infinitive of the verb without to. But if I want to make this sentence affirmative, okay, the answer will be you need to take a driving license. You need to take a driving license. Here, the word need in the affirmative form should be followed by to plus infinitive. Okay, this question. What does the underlined part stand for? You'd better obey your parents. You'd here, it stands for what? You'd, you had, or you would. Apostrophe D here. It's what? Of course, it's had. Well done. Because it's the modal verb had better. Had better. Okay, look at these modal verbs of obligation, prohibition, and advice in the present. Here we have on the right, you can look on the right. How many sentences? We have 4 sentences, 1, 2, 3, and 4. The first one, express obligation or necessity. The first one, number 1, express obligation or necessity. Can you guess which one from these sentences talks about or express obligation or necessity? Good. The first one is D. The letter must say which course you're studying. Must here, it's obligation or necessity. Also, you have to be 18 to open an account without your parents. Here we have to. Good. the letter needs to give your address and date of birth. Here we have the modal verb needs to. These modal verbs must, have to, and needs to. We use them to talk about obligation or necessity. That's right, good. What about number 2? Say there is no obligation or necessity. You can say that there is no obligation by saying don't have to, needn't, and don't need to. What about number 3? Say something is prohibited or not possible. Okay, we use mustn't and aren't allowed to. And also I can use what? Can't. What about number 4? Give advice or recommendation. We use ought to and should to talk about what? Advice or recommendation, and also we can use had better. That's right, good. Modal verbs of obligation, prohibition, and advice in the past. Number 5, question number 5. He is asking you to match the sentences from A to I to the functions from 1 to 5. Look at the modal verbs that are written in blue. The first modal verb, had to, didn't have to, needn't have taken, wasn't allowed to, needed to, should or ought to have looked, shouldn't have done, didn't need to, couldn't. Okay? Function 1. Express obligation and necessity in the past. Which ones from these modal verbs can be used to talk about what? Obligation or necessity in the past. Good. Had to and needed to. That's right. Number 2. Say that something happened but it wasn't necessary. Something happened but it wasn't necessary. It's what? Needn't have taken or needn't have plus verb 3. What about 3? Say that something didn't happen because it wasn't necessary. We have here 2 sentences. The first one, I didn't have to, and the second one, I didn't need to. What about 4? Say something was prohibited or not possible. If something was prohibited or not possible, what are the modal verbs that can be used? Good. It's for wasn't allowed to or couldn't. What about 5? If I want to criticize a past action or say that it was a mistake, we use what? One of should or ought to have the plus verb 3 or shouldn't have plus verb 3. So that's all for the modal verbs. I wish you the best of luck. Goodbye. Thank you so much.